morning, everyone. Hopefully you can't hear that awful sound that's going on right now. Give me just a few minutes, please. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that minor setback. Let's try this again. So thank you all for joining us for our next Tuesday Talk presentation in the series, where we once again are pleased to welcome Anirban Basu. Chuck will do a brief intro in just a few minutes, but as usual, if you have any questions, please enter the questions in the question section on the right-hand side of the screen, and we will take a look at those and get those at the end of the presentation. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Chuck.
Good morning, everyone. We wanted to have Anirban talk to our group. As you may recall, he spoke to us, to the MCA community, in late March when the world seemed to be falling apart. It didn't fall apart, which I guess is good, but it's certainly been a hell of a ride the last 7 to 8 months. And so we really thought it was timely for Anirban to give his sense and forecasts of where things may be headed. So without further ado, Anirban, thanks so much for joining us, and we really value you as a partner of ours.
Well, I'm delighted to be a partner and work with MCA Maryland, and to have a chance to talk again about where we are in this economic cycle. I would agree that the world has not come to an end, but well, we don't know fully the future yet, and we want to talk about the future. Indeed, today's update is entitled Back to the Future, a tribute to 80s movies, and hope that life returns to normal sooner rather than later. So yes, we'll talk about all the things that have taken place so far. Many of the things that have taken place, and of course focus heavily upon construction. Indeed, I have slides on both residential and non-residential construction today, and I also have some slides specifically pertaining to the economy of Maryland. And so let's begin. So you can see Michael J. Fox there and Christopher Lloyd. That movie also starred the likes of Billy Zane and Leah Thompson, also Crispin Glover. So you can see Michael J. Fox looking at his watch and alarm. That's because it reads 2020. Christopher Lloyd doesn't seem particularly happy either. 2020 will of course be remembered for COVID-19. This is a map of global cumulative confirmed cases through yesterday, September 28th. And you might remember back when we spoke together in March, when we were together in late March, we didn't know a lot about the virus, but we thought we knew this, that here we were going to shut down the economy, and we had been doing that. Indeed, many of us began our quarantine circa March 13th. So here in Maryland. So, the notion was, okay, we're going to flatten the curve, but then watch out for COVID-19 come November, December, and January, and also February, as winter emerges once again. The virus loves cool temperatures, and even if we flatten the curve in the summer, that the virus wouldn't necessarily be out of our hair. No one told me back then that we should be worried about Florida and Arizona and Texas and Southern California in June, July, and August, because the notion was that the virus likes cold temperatures, doesn't like warm temperatures. But this map stands for the proposition that whether a nation is close to the equator, India, Brazil, Mexico, or far from the equator, Northern Europe, this virus will hit Americans and other humans wherever they happen to live. And here we are, about 6 months later from our initial meeting during this pandemic, and we are facing the winter squarely in the face. So what's happened in terms of COVID-19 daily cases in America since March? Well, here it is. The red line there is the 7-day average in terms of daily cases. So look, we shut down the economy during roughly the last 3 weeks of March. I would argue to you that the crisis began on March 9th economically, and we can debate when the public health crisis began, but on March 9th, the economic crisis begins. That's what I would say, because on that date, the Dow Jones falls more than 2,000 points, and at that time, that was a daily point decline record on the Dow. We also set new daily point decline records on the Dow on March 12th and March 16th. You might remember the Dow Jones went from 29,000 and change to 18,000 in the blink of an eye. So we shut down the economy, of course. Corporate earnings are affected late March into April, and you can see the curve is flattening. The skinny blue-colored bars are daily cases. But it might be easier to look at this from the lens of the 7-day average. So we flatten the curve into early June. And then what do you see here? And this had not been predicted. You see a spike in cases, and that's your Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Southern California. And I'm going to show you the economic implications of some of that later on in the presentation. Now, as some of those southern states are starting to face the reality of COVID-19 spread, rising hospitalization rates, so on and so forth, and those hospitalization rates have come down more recently. But you can see here, we haven't fully flattened the curve, have we? That in fact, the virus is more present in America now based on daily cases than it was in March and April. Now, what you'll tell me is this, but Anirban, we have more testing now than we did back then. Good point. Good point. That's a fair point. So one of the things that's probably happened in the data is that back in March and April, we probably had many more cases than is reflected in the data because we didn't have as much testing back then. Fair point. Nonetheless, the virus is still here. And again, some of the information that we might have received early in the crisis from public health officials turned out not to be especially correct. Again, the notion was the virus doesn't like warm temperatures. The virus seems to thrive in warm temperatures, and the virus seems to thrive in almost any context. Now, something that we could rely upon was some expectations regarding the economy. So on March 24th, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis economists come out with a study. And this table summarizes that study's key findings. So they basically ask the question, who's vulnerable to job loss as we shut down the economy? So their study encompassed 144.7 million jobs. If you look at the first bolded row here, employed in occupations at low risk of layoff, about 78 million folk, 54% of total employment, 54%. Who are these people that are at low risk of layoff? People employed, for instance, in essential occupations. Well, that's construction, for instance. Construction was not deemed to be essential everywhere. You know, parts of Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, California, so on and so forth, New York and New Jersey, as it turns out. But in much of the country, construction was deemed to be an essential occupation, and of course, comes into this pandemic with plentiful backlog. Like the average contractor has meaningful backlog. Indeed, pre-crisis, a lot of construction firm operators told me, we have more work than we know what to do with. Our problem is we can't find workers. More on that later. Some people who are at low risk of layoff employed in occupations where it's possible to work from home. About 37% of Americans have a job where it's possible to do the job completely from home, 37%. And we'll talk more about that later on in the presentation as well. If you look at the second bolded row here, employed in occupations at high risk of layoff, 46%. And who are these folks? People in food preparation, that's your restaurant worker. People in sales, that's your retail worker. Now, March 24th is during the latter stages of the first quarter. And by this point, the economy is shrinking. But what follows the first quarter, you got it, the second quarter. And the second quarter of 2020 turned out to be the worst quarter of our economic lives. So this is quarterly GDP. And what I've done for you here is I've graphed this on two separate axes. On the left-hand axis, everything through 2019, and that's designated in the blue-colored bars, and everything through 2019. On the right-hand side axis, 2020, the first and second quarters of 2020. Now, we are 1 day away from the end of the third quarter. So we're almost through this quarter, and this quarter has been much better. But let's talk about the first two quarters of the year first. So during the first quarter of the year, the U.S. economy shrinks 5% on an annualized basis, 5%. And that was entirely due to the last, or almost entirely due to the last 3 weeks of March. Because we add jobs in January, we add jobs in February, even though retail sales are starting to slip in February, more on that in a moment. And so the last 3 weeks of March were so heinous that it takes the entire quarter with it. We shrink 5% on an annualized basis during that quarter. But during the second quarter, the economy shrinks 31.7% on an annualized basis. It's the worst quarter of our economic lives by far. During the fourth quarter of 2008, which had been previously the worst quarter of our economic lives, the U.S. economy shrinks 8.4% on an annualized basis. That was a baby compared to this episode. When you've got that kind of vulnerability, and then you get this kind of hit to the economy, this kind of loss in economic activity, what are you going to get? You're going to get a lot of people taking a lot of days off. Now, Ferris Bueller, this is Matthew Broderick, as it turns out, but Ferris Bueller, of course, his day off was voluntary. His day off was voluntary. A lot of people took off some days involuntarily. You can see that in initial claims for unemployment insurance, here graph back to September of 2019. So if you look at the blue segment here, before the crisis begins, the blue linear segment here, we were running at around 210,000 Americans filing for initial unemployment or initially filing for unemployment insurance during any given week. During the week ending March 28th, around the time when we last talked, March 28th, we had 6.9 million Americans file for unemployment insurance. That's about 1 million people per day if you include the weekend. And the following week, another 6.5 million. But lo and behold, what do you see here? You see a sharp downturn in the number of people filing for unemployment insurance. Now, if you're a glass half empty person, you look at this and say, Anirban, I look at your bullet point here. During the week ending September 19th, the advanced figure for seasonally adjusted initial claims was 870,000. Anirban, 870,000 is more than 4 times the pace we're running at pre-crisis, that 210,000 number you mentioned. Fair point. I'm not saying it's great out there. I'm saying that it's less worse. If you're a glass half full person, you look at this and say, we're making progress here. We're making progress. Moreover, this is not the entire story. This is a bit like listening to one side of a conversation, because this reflects how many people are losing jobs. But macroeconomically, we care also about how many people are securing new employment as we recover, or at least initially recover from the pandemic economically. And so to look at that, we might look at continuing claims, the number of people actually on unemployment insurance at any given moment. Now, again, the blue segment here is pre-crisis, pre-pandemic. Then you see the massive increase in the number of people on unemployment insurance. There's actually a separate unemployment insurance. There's the pandemic unemployment assistance. That's a separate group. The federal government estimates that there's millions of people on that form of insurance. That's for folks in the gig economy or who don't normally qualify for routine state unemployment insurance. So that's that group. But so set that aside. This is the routine or standard unemployment insurance. And you can see also again here progress, that we've seen a real decrease in the number of people on unemployment insurance. Now again, if you're a glass half empty person, you look at this and say, Anirban, we have so many people, more people on unemployment insurance than we did back then. Yeah, I'm not saying we're fully recovered. I'm saying that we have recovered partially, and that indeed the initial stages of recovery have been quite brisk. You don't believe me? Let's look at monthly jobs. Let's look at monthly jobs here. So again, I've bifurcated the axes. So on the left-hand axis is indexed all of the monthly jobs data in America through February of 2020. And on the right-hand side in red, the red bars, March, April, May, June, July, August of 2020. And why did I bifurcate the axes? Because, well, you'll see in a second. So we come into the year with great momentum. In January, we had more than 200,000 jobs nationally. In February, we had 251,000 jobs, and February represented the 113th consecutive month of job growth in America, 113 months. And during that 113-month period, we added 22 million jobs as a country. We drove unemployment to 3.5%. That was a 50-year low. You'd have to go back to December of 1969 to find unemployment as low as it had been pre-crisis. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, the Orioles were good back then. That just gives you a sense of how long ago that was. Now we start losing jobs in March, of course, we shut down the economy. In March, again, indexed to the right here, we lose 1.4 million jobs. And then in April, 20.8 million jobs lost. See, if you do the math, between March and April, we lose 22 million jobs, or equivalent to the number of jobs we added for the previous 113 months, 113th month period in which we didn't lose any jobs during any given month, 113-month winning streak. but we gave all that back in 2 months. And economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal, mostly economists who work for large US banks, including investment banks, collectively indicated that we would lose another 8 million jobs in May. Another 8 million jobs in May. That was the consensus forecast. Instead, we add 2.7 million jobs in May. We followed that up with 4.8 million jobs in June. And again, because these numbers are so big, I had to put this on a separate axis. If I tried to graph negative 20.8 million on one unified axis, a lot of these vertical bars would just disappear. So that's the reason for the bifurcation. But again, in May, we had 2.7 million, June, 4.8 million, July, 1.8 million jobs, and then August, nearly 1.4 million jobs. And again, if you took these readings, let's say the 1.4 million jobs added in August, and you tried to index on the left-hand axis, which goes up to 800,000, as it turns out, that's a really tall bar. And again, I would argue to you that the initial phases of recovery have been V-shaped. V-shaped. And I indicated during the first webinar 6 months ago that when recovery began, it would be V-shaped, and that's exactly what it has been. A lot of economists said L-shaped, U-shaped, check mark, Nike swoosh, square root. No, V-shaped, at least the initial stages. Now, we'll talk more about whether or not it's going to stay that way, and of course, the implications for construction and for Maryland. Let's actually, talk a little bit more broadly about the economy. Here's retail sales. So retail sales begin to slump, as it turns out, in February. Indeed, the National Bureau of Economic Research has indicated that the recession officially began in February. And again, I would not say that the economic crisis began in February, but we did see some slippage in economic activity that month. And you might remember why, because by that point, we'd heard about COVID-19. We saw the rising infection rates in Asia and in Europe by that point. At meetings, at conventions, you and I were beginning to social distance. So first we were doing the fist pump instead of shaking hands. Then we did the elbow bump. Then we did the kid and play toe tap, if you know what I'm talking about, and you do, you're from Maryland. And so February is the first month in which retail sales begin to slide. By March and then April, retail sales fall off the table. We shut down the economy, of course they did. Still a fair amount happening online, and we'll have a chance to talk more about that as well. But retail sales begin to really fall off the table during that period, March and April. But lo and behold, what do you see on this slide? May, bounce back. And by June, the series goes to August of 2020, by June, retail sales, believe it or not, are back above their pre-recession highs. Amazing. Why is this? Well, in April, some people got that $1,200 check under the CARES Act, and some other people who became unemployed, many people, millions of people, received $600 in federal unemployment insurance supplements on top of their routine state benefits. So all of a sudden, and I know the narrative out there coming from much media, for instance, is there are a lot of people who can't pay their rent and are facing evictions. And that's true. There are a lot of people facing evictions. On the other hand, as the economy is shut down in April into May, and people are getting money into the household but can't go shopping, right? There's only so much Grubhub you can order online. So they're actually stockpiling cash. More on that very late in the webinar, as it turns out. But as the economy reopens during the early summer, guess what? Retail sales surge. And then we get more retail activity in July and even more in August. And that's particularly impressive. Why? Because July was the last month during which the unemployed, or many of the unemployed, were receiving that $600 weekly supplement on top of their state unemployment insurance benefits. So by that point, the economy was starting to manifest some self-sustaining momentum. So this is all pretty promising. And again, if you look at this slide carefully, if you look at the end of this series, you might be able to carve out the letter V, V for victory, or vibrancy, or vitality, and eventually for vaccine. But from an economist's perspective, vindication, because those of us who said it was going to be V-shaped initially, I think have been proven right. And you can see that in the jobs numbers, you can see that in the retail sales numbers. Now, some other segments have not rebounded as neatly, admittedly. And one of the things that we've done as economists, and others have been doing it too, is looking at high frequency data. Because things are changing so rapidly out there, who has time to wait for monthly and quarterly data releases? So here's some daily data. This comes out each and every day from OpenTable. It's US restaurant reservations. And this green line here represents year-over-year percentage change in seated reservations. Now, You can see as we shut down the economy March into April, this goes to negative 100%, right? My staff graded this slide and they took the y-axis to negative 120%. And I have to tell them, they're mostly in their 20s, that you can only go down as far as negative 100%. But set that aside, you can start to see by very late April into May and June, some recovery in seated reservations. And then what happens? Things flatten out. You see that? July and so on. We stopped seeing much progress in terms of improvement. What's that about? Florida, Georgia, Arizona, Texas, Southern California, these rising infection rates in some of these southern states in particular. More recently, we've seen significant infection rates in places like South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska. But and so again, some of the data. Now, what's hidden from view here is as people stop going to restaurants, as you know, the infection begins to spread deeply into the American South. What's missing here is all of the increase in sales at Grubhub or DoorDash or these other food delivery services. But nonetheless, again, while I would say from a macroeconomic perspective, the early stages of recovery have been V-shaped, there certainly have been many segments, airline travel is another, where the recovery has not been especially brisk. And even though recovery has begun, do not get me wrong, I do not believe that we're anywhere close to complete recovery, not at all. So if you compare August 2019 employment versus August of 2020 employment, we're down 10.2 million jobs. Now, where have we seen the most job loss? Leisure and hospitality. Who are these folks? These are your restaurant workers and your hotel workers. It's exactly the kinds of people who the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis pointed to early in the crisis, saying those are the vulnerable folks, people who can't work remotely, and that includes, of course, people who work in hotels and restaurants. Now, your retail worker is encompassed within that third category, losing about 1.2 million jobs. Leisure and hospitality has lost about 3.8 million jobs. And then professional business services includes a lot of folks who can work remotely. That's your accountants, auditors, attorneys, architects, but that also includes folks who work for temporary staffing agencies. And we've seen a lot of job loss in that category as well. And so, you know, every sector of the economy has lost jobs over the past year. Construction, the sector in which we have most interest today, nearly 300,000 jobs lost, despite its essential status. Now, of course, much more data on construction as we go through this material. Maryland, between August of 2019 and August of 2020, lost 176,000 jobs. I mean, just to put that into context, during a good economic year for Maryland, we had about 40,000 jobs. 40,000 jobs for Maryland is a pretty good year. 60,000 jobs is excellent. That's late 1990s type stuff. But 40,000 jobs is a really, you know, solid year. You know, this is more than 4 years of lost progress. 4 good years of lost progress. And predictably, which sector has lost the most jobs over the past 12 months? You got it, leisure and hospitality, nearly 64,000 jobs lost. Interestingly, the category that includes construction has added jobs on a year-ago basis, 3,700. And it had been said during the very kind introduction, you know, as Chuck pointed out, that the world has not come to an end. That's true. Construction, again, has benefited from its essential industry status, backlog, and also there have been some emergency expenditures made during the pandemic. So, for instance, turning the Baltimore Convention Center into a temporary hospital actually fueled some construction spending, at least earlier in the crisis, that kind of thing. And so that is very good news. Again, one of the things we want to do here today is not just talk about the past, but talk about the future, and we're going to get there. What about the Baltimore metropolitan area? The Baltimore-Columbia-Towson MSA, about 2.8 million people strong, losing about 84,000 jobs over the past 12 months. You can see that in the text box on the southeast corner of the slide, or roughly 5.9% of its jobs. So Baltimore Metro actually has held up better than the country, has held up better than the balance of the state, has actually held up better than most regions. But again, where have we seen the most job loss? Leisure and hospitality. Again, the sector that includes construction. There's not much mining and logging in Baltimore, as it turns out. But that's the way the industry is classified by the government. This is all construction, that segment. But 4,300 jobs to the good on a year-ago basis, pretty impressive. What about the Washington metropolitan area? I'm glad you asked. Negative 201,400 jobs, loss of 6% of job totals. And more than half of the jobs lost in that community have been lost in leisure and hospitality. Washington has been, well positioned for this, right? Because a lot of federal agency workers, a lot of federal government contractors, lots of professional service providers, people who can work from home, but they also have a massive tourism sector and one that depends disproportionately on global travel. And global travel has, for the most part, been shut down. Certainly leisure travel has been shut down globally. And so that has affected disproportionately the Washington metropolitan area. Again, the one segment that has held up the best is government, though construction hasn't lost that many jobs on a year-ago basis. Okay, what about unemployment? So coming into this crisis, what was your principal concern as construction firm operators, if indeed that's who you are? Your principal concern was, I can't find workers, or at least good ones. I can't find electricians. I can't find plumbers. I can't find heating and air conditioning professionals. I can't find roofers. I can't find glaziers. I can't find superintendents. And I sure as heck cannot find estimators. Well, that was when unemployment was 3.5%. My guess is those types of workers, good ones, are still difficult to find, as it turns out. But we have lost nearly 300,000 construction jobs on a year-ago basis nationally. Now here I'm showing you three rates of unemployment: men in blue, women in green, overall in red. The unemployment rate, as I say, coming into the crisis was 3.5%. And then by April, we're at 14.7% nationally. And indeed, I can never prove this to you, but I would contend that by late April, the unemployment rate in this country was closer to 20% and maybe a bit above. A couple of reasons to believe that. Number one, there were some survey questions added to the survey that underlies the unemployment rate estimates that were difficult for people to answer correctly. And because of that glitchiness in the survey, most economists who have looked at this conclude that unemployment was understated in April by around 3 to 5 percentage points. Moreover, the so-called reference week, the week during which that survey was taken, was relatively early in April. And so a lot of the damage done in April itself was not reflected in that unemployment rate statistic. It was actually in late April that the country was most shut down. If you look at cell phone mobility data, the movement of cell phones around the country, that's when we're most shut in, was in late April. So again, I can never prove it to you. The official rate of unemployment in April was 14.7%, but again, I think it was at some point that month closer to 20%. But set that aside, more recently, you've seen the decline here, the overall rate of unemployment down to 8.4%. And during the previous period of economic stress, unemployment rose faster for men than for women, and that had a lot to do with the 2.3 million jobs lost in construction. This time it's been harder for women, who are more aligned with retail trade, leisure and hospitality, daycare centers, private education, public education, other sectors that have been interrupted, healthcare, by the pandemic. In any case, the unemployment rate has fallen pretty rapidly. And if you turn this line upside down, right, because the lower the number, the better in this case. So if you turn this line upside down, you actually see the letter V. Because again, the pace of recovery since it began in May has been quite brisk, I would argue, V-shaped. This is unemployment rates for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America. And who has the lowest rate of unemployment among the 25 largest communities in America? Baltimore. Now, I would have much rather won yesterday's game, but I take some solace in the fact that this region has held up reasonably well in the face of adversity. Why is this? Why has Baltimore held up relatively well? The structure of the economy here. The structure of the economy here. So a lot of federal government agency workers, so people who work for the National Security Agency, Social Security Administration, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, a lot of defense contractors and government contractors generally, a lot of professional services providers, fairly large financial services sector, a lot of medical researchers. So the structure of the economy has really helped out. Washington Metro at number 4 here, and Washington Metro rarely has an unemployment rate above Baltimore's, but again, this is because of all that job loss in leisure and hospitality. The leisure and hospitality sector, of course, in Washington is much larger than in Baltimore. Who has the highest unemployment rate? Well, you can see here Los Angeles. The governor there, very handsome gentleman, Gavin Newsom, has really kept this economy shut down. So public policy plays a part in this as well. So you'll see high rates of unemployment in Los Angeles, but also in Riverside, San Diego, San Francisco. So on the right-hand column, higher rates of unemployment. New York, of course, a viral epicenter, but where Governor Andrew Cuomo has really kept that economy shut down. The governor of Massachusetts doesn't get much attention, Charlie Baker, but he has also been very aggressive in keeping that economy shut down. In fact, in July itself, the unemployment rate in Massachusetts was 16.1%. That was the highest in the country. So public policy plays a part. Southern governors, generally speaking, have been more aggressive in opening up their economy. The first to reopen his economy was Governor Brian Kemp in Georgia around April 20th. A few days after that, his fellow governor out of Florida, Ron DeSantis, opens up his economy. So again, public policy also plays a role in shaping these data. Now I will show you 7 consecutive slides with construction data. So this is the fun part. Number 1, U.S. single-family building permits. So this is a leading indicator of residential construction. You have to pull a permit before you can build anything. Now this is single-family building permits. Now notice that late last year, we see this surge in single-family building permits. Well, of course we do. If you spoke to realtors pre-crisis, what might they have said to you? Look, I got lots of people looking for homes. I have baby boomers looking to downsize. I have millennials coming of age and forming households. Here's my problem. I got lots of people looking. I got nothing to show them. The inventory of unsold homes is low. So home builders who ended last year with a 20-year high in confidence, home builders look at that and say, I have an opportunity here to meet unmet demand. I want to pull some permits. I want to build. Now, pandemic hits. Single-family building permits fall. Of course they do. And part of that is because the offices that issued the permits in some instances themselves were shut down. They were not open to issue permits. Again, ladies and gentlemen, what do you see here? A sharp bounce back in building permits. In fact, above the pre-recession highs. And what's the story here? The suburbs. The previous decade was about the cities. The previous decade was about millennials moving to cities. And often what was built for them were high-rise apartment buildings with retail ground floor. That was the model of the previous decade. This decade will be about attached and detached single-family homes. This year, the most common age in America is 28. We have more 28-year-olds than any other age. The second most common age in America, 29. Third most common age in America, 27. Now, 5 years ago, the most common age in America was 23. What do people do when they're 23? Well, some people rent apartments. I mean, some people stay with mom and dad, some people buy homes, but a lot of people rent apartments. And so that helped to spawn those demographics, that apartment building boom. But in 5 years, the most common age will be 33. We'll be in the middle of the middle of the current decade by then, and the most common age will be 33. What do people do when they're in their 30s? Well, lots of things. But one of them is buy a home often. So the previous decade was about the cities. The next decade is about the suburbs. And I'm simplifying, but that's what I think is going to happen. In any case, this is a leading indicator telling us that residential construction of the single-family variety will be quite aggressive during the months ahead, and even during the midst of a pandemic. Now, let's continue with the construction story. This is non-residential construction put in place, non-residential construction. Now, you can see if you look at the tail end here, this is basically non-residential construction spending. For the tail end of the series, you see that decline in spending. Yeah, sure. Now, we can break this down. Where has that decline transpired? Because this COVID-19 episode has really altered the economy structure in many ways. Let's talk about that. So it's defined by the U.S. Census Bureau. There's 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country. All 16 are represented or reflected here. And these horizontal bars reflect the change in construction spending, the percentage change in construction spending for the 5-year period spanning from July 2015 to July of 2020. We'll get the August construction spending data in a few days, as it turns out, but they're not yet available. So what do you see here? At the top is a category called public safety. Now, again, remember all that money the government spent to turn the Javits Center in New York into a temporary hospital, or the Baltimore Convention Center, or the Denver Convention Center? Those monies were categorized as being public safety expenditures. So that's why you see that lumpy increase. But what else did we build in large amounts pre-crisis? Again, because this mostly reflects the pre-crisis period. Office space, we built a lot of offices, and lodging at number 5, that's hotel room construction. So here we are in the situation where we've learned more people can work remotely. And here's the thing, we actually knew they could work remotely. That's nothing new. People have been working from home for a long time. Here's the thing, They might work at home 1 day a week or 2 days a week and then go in the rest of the days of the week. What we did not realize is that people can work completely from home, never go into the office, and actually be more productive in their jobs. That's what we have learned. If you think about it, that's not good for non-residential construction or office construction, right? Because what we've learned is that when people are at work, they have a tendency to contemplate coworkers, to hang out at the water cooler, to fill out their brackets. That didn't happen this year. And I say 37% of jobs can be done purely from home now in this connected economy. And we built a lot of hotel rooms just before a pandemic destroyed the global travel industry, at least for a time. You can see the airlines are on the verge of massive layoffs absent another stimulus package. More on that in a moment. Now, you say, well, this is 5 years of data, Anirban, but you know what would be really interesting? Just show us 1 year. Give us some sense of what's happened along these dimensions over the past year. I mean, during this period of this pandemic. Here you go. So this is the same 16 categories, but I'm comparing July 2019 versus July 2020. And you can see that big jump in the public safety expenditures. And again, that's because all that construction that took place to turn places into temporary hospitals, including arenas, showed up in that public safety category. But where do you see the declines over the past year in construction spending? Well, office and lodging are two of the categories that have been most affected. Of course, we built a lot coming into the cycle. We'd saturated the market, and all of a sudden, we don't need as much office space, we don't need as many hotel rooms. So what are you going to get? You're going to get less new construction. Let's talk about leading indicators. So I've shown you the history. Let's talk about some leading indicators. This is one of the favorites for commercial construction. It's the Architecture Billings Index. You see the 50-yard line running across that slide, the 50-yard line? Any reading below 50 means that architects are less busy this month than they were last month. Well, you can see here, in August, architects were less busy than they were in July. And in July, less busy than they were in June. And in June, less busy than they were in May, and so on. So why is this leading indicator? Because if architects are not busy upstream, contractors will not be busy downstream. Again, contractors need to work on projects that involve architects as part of the design team. So, public infrastructure projects, generally speaking, don't involve architects, at least not as much, but office space, hotels, retail space, so on and so forth, often architects are involved. And this is the kind of demand that is shrinking because we have so much retail vacancy, right? When you've got the bankruptcy of Neiman Marcus and Brooks Brothers and J. Crew and J.C. Penney and the parent company of Lane Bryant, and before the crisis really began, Pier 1 Imports, and the closure of the Barnes & Noble store in downtown Baltimore and the Dick's restaurant right next door, basically, and so on and so forth, the Joseph A. Bank store downtown Baltimore, where I shopped a lot, as it turns out, often because I forgot to wear a belt to work. That space is now unspoken for. It's not tenanted. So that quashes the demand for new construction, suppresses it. Here's another thing. One of the things I do is I'm the National Chief Economist for Associate Builders and Contractors. And one of the things that we do is we survey our members. We have about 20,000 members around the country. And we ask them about backlog. What's your backlog? And it's measured in months here, months of backlog. And what we've seen over the period of the crisis, generally speaking, is a decline in backlog, because a lot of project cancellations. We saw some recovery in August, but backlog is not what it was. And some contractors, about 14% of respondents, are telling me that we're getting pretty close to running out of backlog. So for some contractors, 2021 is looking pretty grim. Because what I also hear anecdotally from contractors is that, well, there are fewer opportunities to bid on projects. And when we do bid on projects, the competition is fierce. A lot of people bidding, which means that perhaps the winner of the bid turns out to be the loser because they underbid and they have too few contingencies built into their contract, such as the nature of tough economic times. But the leading indicator is not very positive. Here's another one. One of the other things I do is I'm chief economist of the Construction Financial Management Association, CFMA. This is largely an organization of CFOs at major US construction firms. So one of the things we do there is we do a CONFINDEX survey. We call it the CONFINDEX survey. This is the overall confidence index reading since August of 2008. And you can see here the confidence looking forward about 6 months. It's not much higher than it was during the period of the Great Recession. So a lot of construction activity is held up in 2020. We came to grips with backlog, essential industry. But now with credit conditions tightening, with the economy having shrunk, while so many jobs, learning that so many people can work remotely, there are segments of construction that have been bolstered, as it turns out, by COVID-19. So e-commerce has gotten a major push forward. What's the backbone of e-commerce? Data centers, fulfillment centers, trucking. So some economic segments, and including those that pertain to construction, data centers, fulfillment centers, have gotten a push forward. Those segments should be quite strong. Manufacturing, domestic manufacturing will probably be stronger. We'll see more reshoring of production back to America because CEOs are so tired of these consistent or persistent supply chain disruptions. Now, last few minutes together before I take Q&A. So just give me like 5 more minutes as I walk through these slides. So obviously the public health data will shape the economic outcomes to come. But that's certainly been what we've seen over the course of this year, right? We shut down the economy in March. Why? This is the public health data and concerns that healthcare systems would be overwhelmed with COVID-19 patients. Didn't have enough ICU beds, didn't have enough ventilators, so on and so forth. This is US projected deaths per day. And you can see that red solid line, and then it becomes dashed, and then it's sort of vertical a line that says today, and then the forecast. So, look, uncertain future, right? So if you look at that dotted red line that goes upwards on the slide to the right, that's if we continue to ease mandates. We continue to reopen the economy, which, by the way, we have been, right? We continue to open restaurants for, more indoor dining capacity, so on and so forth. We've opened movie theaters up, at least in parts of the country. So we're coming into more contact with one another now. So if mandates keep easing and winter is coming, right? This slide ends with January 1st of next year, we see a rapid rise. Now the middle line there, sort of purple colored line, is the current projection. So the notion is that, well, some mandates will ease, but some won't. And sort of the baseline outlook is that purple dashed line. But look there, we have more projected deaths per day, right, by the winter months than we did back in April. So what does that mean to me? That means that the chance that we're going to shut down the economy again is quite high. And then the green dashed line is if we adopt universal masks. Everyone wears masks. And obviously not everyone's wearing masks. And I don't want to get political about this. But one of my things my 14-year-old daughter does, she plays field hockey. She plays for Towson Town. And we just played Jarrettsville a couple of weekends ago, Jarrettsville. So it was a clash of titans, Towson Town versus Jarrettsville. And people view the world differently and they view COVID-19 differently. All of the Towson Town fans, all of us parents, Towson Town, all in masks, right? All masked up. The folks from Jarrettsville, no masks. I don't know, I can't explain it. But in any case, the virus is still with us. And some of the forecasts here are pretty gloomy from a public health perspective. Here's US projected hospital resource use. So that purple dashed line reflects all beds needed. You can see that surge in April, sort of demand for hospital beds. Now, you can see the past today, that vertical line, what the forecast is, again, in this dotted or dashed purple line. And this, you see this purple haze around that line, that's what I call the zone of uncertainty. Forecasts just don't know how bad it's going to get. But if you look at the baseline projection, which is that dotted purple line, lots of beds will be needed. Now the green dotted line, that's ICU beds needed, intensive care unit beds needed, right? And you can see there's expected surge in that. And then the blue dashed line, that's invasive ventilators needed. And you can see that the expected demand for ventilators is actually above what it was in April. Now, here's the thing, we have more ventilators now. We have more ICU beds now. That's absolutely correct if that's what you're thinking. But when governors see rising cases and more deaths, and hospitals are more crowded, what are they going to do? My guess is, and I hate saying this is my baseline forecast, they're going to shut down the economy again. And I hope I'm wrong about that. But that's what drove us into recession. It was a supply shock, not a demand shock, a supply shock. We shut down the economy. We could not supply. Now, of course, there's 20.8 million jobs are lost in April because of that supply shock. That triggers a follow-on demand shock. Absolutely true. Now, yes, as evidence that we're better prepared than we were back in March and April, look at testing. We're testing a lot more folks. I believe around 27% of Americans have now been tested, something like that. Or perhaps that's Marylanders. I've seen that statistic recently, 27%. But we're doing more testing than we once did. We have more tests than we once did. We have more contact tracing than we once did. So we're better prepared for another surge in COVID-19 infections than we were. There's no question about that. We now know that the Gilead Sciences remdesivir has some clinical efficacy. But again, shutting down the economy is a political decision. It's not a scientific one. It's not, if we get to this infection rate, we'll shut down the economy. It's, I'm getting yelled at, I'm governor of Maryland or Florida or New York or California. I'm getting yelled at. People are saying, shut down the economy again. You're killing people by not shutting down the economy. Guess what I'm going to do as a politician? I might shut down the economy. And that's not good. Some states are already reversing their reopenings. This is as of September 25th. And you can see the legend here. In the sort of dark blue reopened states, in the light colored blue reopening states, in the tan, well, I guess it's a light beige, they're pausing reopening states like Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas. And then in states like California, Arizona, and Texas, they're reversing reopenings. Again, a lot of these are political decisions, right? Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, he's not reversing his decisions. Governor Brian Kemp in Georgia, he's not reversing his decisions. The public health data might indicate that they should, but that's not the point. They've made up their mind. So we're very different, whether we're from Towson or Jarrettsville or Florida or New York or California, we're very different in terms of how we're dealing with this, how we view this. So what can unite us? A vaccine? Now, good news is we have over 200 clinical trials taking place globally, and I could not have said this in March, of course, but over 200 clinical trials taking place globally looking at therapies and vaccines. Pfizer is in phase 3. Moderna is in phase 3. Johnson & Johnson has had some spectacular results from its candidate vaccine, right? According to the Milken Institute, there are currently 212 vaccines in various stages of development. So we have over 200 shots on goal here, coming from some of the finest scientists in the world. So what's coming to America? Well, this is the expectation. These are the major economic forecasts for US GDP growth. This comes from organizations like the World Bank, for instance, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This maroon colored bar here is 2020. The orange colored bar is 2021. So the expectation is the economy shrinks massively in 2020 and bounces back in 2021. Though, again, the forecasts vary. If you're thinking about what about American forecasts, this comes from the Congressional Budget Office. Too many lines on here by half. But what they're projecting is that for the current year, the economy will shrink 6%, and the June 2020 projection, which is in the dark blue, suggests that next year will grow around 4%. So we won't be fully recovered by the end of 2021. That's basically what these forecasts say, and I would agree with that, particularly if I'm right that another recession is coming. And again, a recession is coming because of a political outcome, because we're going to decide to shut down the economy. Really, certain states will decide to shut down their economies again as these infection rates begin to spread or rise again. This is the anxious index, and boy, am I anxious. This is the probability of GDP decline in the next quarter. This is based on a survey of economists. Now, this is the 1 quarter ahead probability of decline in real GDP, and you can see it's, things have improved. Economists are more comfortable about the economic outlook more recently, but economists are always wrong. And when I was saying that we'd have a V-shaped recovery during the early stages of the crisis, a lot of economists were saying, no, we won't, but we had a V-shape. Now a lot of economists are saying, hey, we're coming out of this pretty fast. It's much better than we thought it was going to be. And I'm saying the opposite. Yeah, we have come out of this pretty quickly. The initial stages of recovery have been quite robust, but I think we're in for a tough winter, particularly if we don't get another stimulus package passed. Now, the stock market was up yesterday pretty massively, in part because the House Democrats are moving forward with their plans for a stimulus. And they want to take a bill and give it to the Republicans in the Senate. We'll see if it goes anywhere. Doesn't matter if the House passes the bill if the Senate Republicans say, nah, not interested. And of course, we've got an election coming up in about a month. So lots of uncertainty. And then after that election, 2-month congressional lame duck session. And we might get a stimulus package during the lame duck session, as it turns out, right? Once the politics are behind us and we can focus on the economic situation in America. Again, one of the reasons I said that it would be a V-shaped recovery during the early stages is because of this. This comes from Goldman Sachs, the economic impact of past pandemics on advanced societies. Again, just fixate on one line for me here, the light blue colored bar that goes way up to the top and back down again. All I'm trying to say with that line is that generally speaking, that's Hong Kong SARS 2003, Hong Kong SARS 2003. All I'm trying to say here is that generally speaking, after pandemics knock down an economy, they bounce back quickly. And one of the reasons for that is that we stimulate these economies during times of crisis. To date, we've had 4 phases of stimulus. The big one here is phase 3. That's the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, a $2.2 trillion package. Actually, even before the Dow Jones began to slip on March 9th, phase 1 was in place. Congress went to work immediately. It's just that they're broken down recently because of the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Supreme Court Justice, and the controversy about nominating a replacement, and of course the fact that the election is about a month away. So politics is in the air, and it's difficult to make good policies when you're in such a politicized environment. But the economy now is operating basically without stimulus. It's on its own, and here comes winter, and that's a problem. Now, I made this or expressed this juxtaposition between demand and supply just a moment ago. Let me try to clarify that. Demand for goods and services in the economy is actually pretty strong. This is the U.S. savings rate. This is savings as a percentage of personal disposable income. Now, pre-crisis, the U.S. household savings rate is around 8%. 8%. So 8 cents of every dollar is being saved. In April, people start getting those checks. Some people get that unemployment insurance supplement. So by April, the U.S. savings rate is, believe it or not, 33%. Some people are stockpiling cash. Yes, other people can't make their rent, but there are other families that are actually stockpiling cash. Money's coming into the household. They can't spend it. The mall is closed. Now, as we open up the economy in May and June, they start spending that money. But as late as July, you can see here the savings rate is still a lofty 18%. There's a lot of household cash in this economy. Households have money to spend. So it's not a demand side problem, it's a supply side problem. Shutting down the economy again. If we can avoid shutting down the economy again, I think we'll be fine going into 2021. It's just that that's not my baseline forecast. So this is a repeat of what I said to you in March. I said the initial phase of recovery from the crisis will be sharp, profound, and most welcome. That's exactly what it has been. As people have re-engaged the economy, they found low interest rates. Their pent-up demand has been high for all kinds of things: homes, used cars, appliances, softwood lumber. I don't know if you follow softwood lumber prices that exploded during this period. There's been a need to rebuild inventories, including at auto dealerships, softwood lumber suppliers, so on and so forth. And people are anxious to meet again. We're human beings, and we're Americans, and we're Marylanders. So we're social beings. We want to go to restaurants. We want to go to casinos, many of us. We want to see a movie, and not on Netflix, and not in our homes, but in an actual theater with heavily buttered popcorn, with too much salt, and a large Coca-Cola and Twizzlers. It's the American way. Now, if you're going to watch something on Netflix, might I recommend Indian Matchmaking? Phenomenal. We want to watch the Orioles in person and engage in other activities. May's jobs report, stunner. And indeed, the fact of the matter is this economic expansion has surprised a lot of economists. It's been much more robust, but this is exactly what I thought would happen, because that's what happened in Hong Kong and other places when they were coming back from pandemics. Here's the problem. In Hong Kong, 2003, they were one and done. They flattened the curve and they were done and they recovered. Our problem is we're about to double dip. We flattened the curve, sort of, and now here it comes again. So while the recovery has begun, these remain treacherous times, obviously. We haven't yet endured a V-shaped recovery because we haven't fully flattened the curve and we don't have a vaccine. So I hope I'm wrong about that, but I'll leave it at that. And we have about 5 minutes left for Q&A. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Anirban. That was awesome. Again, if anyone has any questions, please type them in the question box on the right-hand side, and we'll go ahead and answer them.
Right. Don't be shy. And if you want to take more than 5 minutes, we can. I censor the people's time, and it's 8:27 Eastern Standard Time. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to try my hand at them.
Anirban, really outstanding presentation. Thank you. I noticed in your presentation the construction spending for 5 years ending July 2020. The number that was so high was specifically in public safety. I think it was 89%, give or take. There was a thing that came out this summer called the Defund the Police movement. Any thoughts on that and how that could tie into public safety down the road? We've seen New York City cut public safety by $1 billion through their Defund the Police movement.
Yeah, the Minneapolis City Council actually passed a bill defunding the police. So public safety includes police stations, construction of police stations, fire stations, prisons, and jails. Right? So if you've got a movement to defund the police, if you've got a movement to imprison fewer people, for instance, then obviously that's going to affect construction in those categories. It's going to affect much more than that, obviously. It's going to affect quality of life. I have to tell you, I try not to be political, but I'm not a fan of defunding the police. When I'm in trouble, you know who I call? Not a social worker, I call the police. But in any case, set that aside, people have different views on this, but or the fire department. But yeah, no, look, I don't think that movement will gain much currency. I'll tell you why. If you look at homicide rates in major US cities, they are surging. And Baltimore is not alone in this. I mean, do you see what happened in Chicago this weekend? You know, 5-year-old stabbed to death and so on and so forth. When you've got that kinds of activity, that defund the police movement is not going to last. Because people are getting hurt or worse in very large numbers in American cities. Look at the crime rate in New York City, for instance. Do you think New York City can afford not to have more police officers or the same number of police officers? We've got surging crime rates. So, it happened this summer. Defund the police, lots of anger and so on and so forth. I get it. There have been some really horrific incidents between the police and the general public. I think that's true. It's on camera. That said, we've got some social demands, and one of them is for public safety. One of them is to have our streets be safe. Some politicians deliver on that, some don't. I would say the politicians in Baltimore City don't really seem to care that much about public safety. Set that aside. In most communities, they really care. So I would expect to see not much effect from that on public safety investment. And that's my hope, and it's actually my belief as well.
Thank you. The concern I think some people have is long-term structural unemployment and sectors that could be hit, not just a 6-month blip, but do you see any specific employment industries that may look very different a year or 2, 3 years from now?
Yeah, I'll give you an example, construction. So, during the Great Recession, during the global financial crisis of now more than a decade ago, we lost 2.3 million construction jobs. And the Census Bureau conducted a study looking at what happened to construction workers who had lost their jobs during that moment of economic stress. And they found that by 2013, 60% of those construction workers had left the industry permanently, either because they had retired or because they found jobs in other industries, whether oil and natural gas or retail, started to work for Home Depot, for instance, or driving Lyft or Uber, whatever, but they left for other industries. So one of the things that could happen, as we've seen some construction workers dislocated, is that they end up leaving the construction industry. And here's another thing. The average age of the electrician in America is nearly 60. So we're going to see a profound amount of retirement of skilled craftspeople going forward. And obviously, we don't have enough young people entering the industries. So lots of changes there. And yes, you mentioned long-term unemployment. One of the things that happens when people are long-term unemployed is they sometimes drop out of the labor force altogether. They become discouraged workers. They stop looking for work. And we do have a quite low labor force participation rate right now. It was low coming into the crisis. It's even lower now. And so that's an issue.
Thank you. I have a question from our group here. What do you anticipate the long-term effect of the USMCA could be on the lumber industry? Any thoughts on that? We see mills recovering, open up closer to their pre-lockdown scales.
Right, I know it's a big concern because in some markets, lumber prices have gone up 50%. Some folks have delayed ordering their lumber packages and so on and so forth, but the owners of projects want to get things into the ground and into the air. So very challenging time along the softwood lumber dimension. Our experience as economists, when we see spikes in commodity prices like that, is that supply responds quickly. And late last year, we ratified the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, and that, a lot of the softwood lumber issues were because there's been this multi-decade battle between the Canadians and the Americans over softwood lumber, and how the Canadians treat their softwood lumber. Do they subsidize and so on and so forth? I'll let people decide on who's on the right side of that issue historically. but that was one of the reasons we stopped, we put major tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber. And then here comes this pandemic, and during the pandemic, a booming demand for single-family homes. And so, I think that the increase in softwood lumber is profound, but relatively short-term. And later this year and early next year, you'll start to see softwood lumber prices come back down to earth. And I think that the questioner is right that we are starting to see some of that capacity come back online.
Do we have any other questions from the group?
Looks like we finished.
There we go.
You got one?
Yep.
We got one more question, Anirban. That's interesting. In your estimation, are home starts booming due to people moving out of cities?
Well, to a certain extent, yes. So there's a narrative out there that suggests that people are escaping cities. I don't think it's necessarily that they're escaping cities. In some cases, they are. I mean, look, if you're a resident of Portland, Oregon, and you see protests downtown each and every day for more than 3 months, that could be the kind of thing that causes you to move out. Some people might say, oh, I want to be part of that action. I'll move it to Portland. People are different. But I think what's really happening is people are looking for ownership opportunities. And why are they looking for ownership opportunities? Number one, they might want to move to the suburbs to social distance. And one way to social distance is to own your own home, right? Because no one else is, using your front door, right? That's my front door. Number two, it's the way to take advantage of low mortgage rates. Right? Mortgage rates, the yield on the 10-year treasury right now is 0.651%. We might not see interest rates ever this low again. The only way to take advantage of that is to borrow at those low interest rates and buy something. And so people are doing that. Number three, home office. A lot of people want some extra square footage for a home office. And often those types of homes with the extra square footage are in the suburbs. If you look, for instance, at Washington, D.C.'s condominium market, it's red hot. A lot of people are interested in buying condominiums in Washington, D.C. So they're not escaping the city, but the buying opportunities tend to be in the suburbs. The land to develop new product or owner-occupied product tends to be in the suburbs. And so that's what we are seeing. And so, and then demographics. I said that, millennials are coming of age and more of them are becoming first-time homebuyers. We saw that before the pandemic, but we're certainly seeing it now. And so it's not just to escape the cities. I think that's too simple a narrative. There's a lot of factors, a confluence of factors that have caused this to happen. But again, big decade for the suburbs.
Really outstanding presentation, Anirban, and good questions from the crowd. Thank you very much. We really appreciate this, and as always, we really do value the partnership we've had with you for a long time, Anirban, and you've been such a great resource to our membership. I want to maybe have Melissa talk about if people want to see this presentation later on. Is that possible?
Sure. I mean, once we'll be sending out the link, the recording probably in the next few hours, like late morning, early afternoon. So just keep an eye out for it. And if you have any questions, or if you don't receive it by this afternoon, just give me a shout and let me know, and I'll send it on to you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Anirban.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.